There we go.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to just wait until the room fills up and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll wait about 30 more seconds. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Global Studies Summer Film Festival. My name is Shaina Hammerman. I am the Associate Director of Jewish Studies at the Center for Jewish Studies, the Taube Center. And the theme for this virtual summer series is Love in the Time of Cinema. So hopefully you watched this film and you've thought a little bit about the theme of love. This evening's conversation about Tel Aviv on Fire is the 6th of 7 films that we're presenting for the summer. That means there's still time to watch the final film, which is called Chicken with Plums. Tonight's film is sponsored by the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and I am so delighted to say that our discussion will be led by Dr. Oren Kroll-Zeldin, who is the Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies and the Interim Director for the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco, where he teaches courses on topics including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in film. So this is something that he knows quite a bit about. And Oren is currently working on a book about young Jewish American anti-occupation activists and the politics of Jewish identity. So the way tonight is going to go is Oren will reflect on the film for a few minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of the time doing a Q&A. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we encourage your participation. And I will be looking at those questions as Oren and I discuss the film. Please note that this conversation is being recorded, but none of your names or voices will be displayed. Finally, if you would like to add your name to our Summer Film Festival mailing list, you can visit the News and Events section of the Stanford Global Studies website. We only use this list to send information about international films. So thank you again for coming, and thank you so much, Oren, for participating, and we hope that you enjoyed the film. Take it away, Oren.
All right, thank you very much, Shaina, and thank you to the Taube Center at Stanford and to everyone at the Stanford Global Studies Summer Film Festival for inviting me tonight, and really also mostly for inviting people to watch this wonderfully entertaining film. Tel Aviv on Fire really is, in my mind, a fun and comedic view of Palestinian life under occupation. And I have to say that I have tremendous admiration and respect for Sameh Zouabi, the filmmaker who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel, for making a comedy that focuses on this geopolitical conflict in Palestine and Israel. I think it takes a lot of courage to find light in the midst of this increasingly dark situation. And Zouabi's script, which he co-wrote with Dan Kleinman, who is a Jewish Israeli man, the script certainly finds humor in the totally and utterly absurd. Also, in the face of such a dark period in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, humor is most certainly a welcome change from the intensity of the ongoing clashes and from the deepening entrenchment of the status quo. I have seen many feel-bad movies about the conflict, and I think it is highly refreshing to see what I will happily call a feel-good movie about this conflict and a feel-good movie based in Palestine and Israel. Before I say a few things about the film, let me talk a little bit about who made the film and who stars in it, because the Israeli and Palestinian film scenes are quite small. And so many of the actors may be familiar to some of you who watch a lot of movies or TV shows from the region. This is not the first time that Salam, who's played by Kais Nashaf, and Tallah, played by Lubna Azabal, have shared the screen. Enthusiasts of Palestinian film will certainly recognize them from Paradise Now, which is a film from 2005, which met tremendous acclaim and was, I think, one of 2 Palestinian films to be nominated for an Oscar. It was a timely reflection on suicide bombings in 2005, right in the sort of the ending period of the second Intifada. Sameh Zawabi, who is the director and co-writer of Tel Aviv on Fire, actually co-wrote the film The Idol, which is about Palestinian singer Mohammed Asaf, with Hani Abu Assad, who's the director of Paradise Now. All of these connections are intentional in people sort of writing films, making films together, hiring the same actors. Salim Dow, who plays Atef, who's the TV director, the director of the soap opera in the movie. He's likely a familiar face from his role in the hit TV show Arab Labor, which was popular in both, or is still popular in both Israeli and Palestinian societies, much like the soap opera Tel Aviv on Fire. And the film is popular in both societies and has high viewership in both. Also, Yusuf Swade, who plays General Yehuda Edelman. He is a famous Palestinian actor. Most recently, he was in Unorthodox, but he's best known for his role as Ashraf in the film The Bubble, which is Eitan Fox's film about a love affair between an Israeli man and a Palestinian man, 2 star-crossed lovers. But enough about who's in it, although I find that interesting. Not necessarily everybody does. Let's talk about the humor in this film, because I think that's one of the greatest strengths within this film. This film is intended to be funny. And so let me highlight some of the important sort of humorous moments in this film before I offer and express a critique. So I love the fact that this film makes fun of a lot of things, and I think is an equal, is sort of like an equal opportunity critic in its willingness to poke fun both at Palestinian and at Jewish Israeli societies. As examples, I'll express what I like to call, or what I will call, the 3 H's, and that's Hebrew, hummus, and the Holocaust. All 3 very, very important things to poke fun of in a film, and they do so in very important and rather powerful ways, I think. With regards to Hebrew, Salam is originally brought in to consult on the Hebrew dialogue for the production of the soap opera Tel Aviv on Fire, because being raised in Israeli society, he knows Hebrew well. And what's the first thing that he does to interject in this role is to say that it's insulting to use the term explosive, pitzutz, to describe a woman. Now, on the surface, that's not necessarily all that funny, but while a debate ensues on the set of the TV show, we, the audience, are left to grapple with something that they intentionally leave out of the dialogue, and that's the impact of the not so subtle reference to Palestinian suicide bombers. And this is a reference being made by the Palestinians themselves. Again, poking fun at themselves. It's a self-deprecating type of humor about the Hebrew language. Hummus, the film points to the ways that Jewish Israelis romanticize and really, even in many ways, orientalize Palestinian hummus. Everyone knows the best place to get hummus, and everyone argues. It's certainly a hot topic to discuss who has the best hummus, who makes it, where you can find it. So when Asi, the Israeli officer at the checkpoint, says that he'll help Salam to write his scenes in exchange for hummus, we get a glimpse into this sort of sector of Israeli society that likes to glorify who will make the best hummus. But then when Salam brings him hummus made from the expired cans of garbanzo beans, we see that the joke is actually on Asi. The joke is on the Israeli officer. And of course, the film also makes fun of the fact that Salam, a Palestinian writer, we can debate whether or not he's a writer, but Salam himself doesn't like hummus. Why? Because during the first Intifada, all he did for a long period of time was eat hummus made from canned beans. Again, just making fun of their own society. With regards to the Holocaust, and there's a vast literature on humor in the Holocaust and humor in film, making fun of the Holocaust, Asi, in writing lines for General Edelman, the Israeli general character in the soap opera, he comes up with certain statements such as, I promised my parents that there'd never be another Holocaust, and that's why I joined the IDF. We are meant to find that funny in its sort of simultaneous absurdity and the fact that this is certainly a narrative and a communal truth that circulates. He also says, my people need me. These are hard times. The humor, I think, is found in the simplicity and the sort of the straightforward nature of this dialogue. There's nothing hiding or even attempting to cloak this Zionist message that's emanating from the IDF officer at the checkpoint who's charged with the very task of ensuring that there is never another Holocaust. These lines, which really, they represent the very mainstream and dominant Jewish Israeli narrative, are understood to be too Zionist for a Palestinian TV show, for a Palestinian soap opera. And yet it is perhaps lines like these that illustrate the reason that the TV show, Tel Aviv on Fire, is so popular among both a Palestinian and Israeli audience. It's able to speak to multiple audiences simultaneously. That's the end of the 3 H's, but I have a few other sort of humorous-ish things that I want to point out, which first is the power dynamics. Power dynamics are always important to pay attention to when talking about the Palestine-Israel conflict. And here in this film, we see it play out in fairly interesting ways and in multiple ways. But just as an example, Asi, who's the head of the officer at a checkpoint, can absolutely abuse his power in many ways. But he chooses to do it in a rather sort of mundane or tame way by becoming Salam's writing partner. Asi, however, is not fully able to manipulate the arc of the TV show's plot, though he tries extremely hard, even by taking away Salam's ID card. And this ID card is the single most important document in the life of a Palestinian, assuming from Jerusalem. We assume that Salam is a Jerusalemite crossing back and forth over this checkpoint. And by taking this document away, he is exerting some power. But then in the end, in a strange twist of this power dynamic, it's Salam who quote unquote promotes Asi from the checkpoint to being a lead actor on the TV show, which in and of itself is absurd and funny, but it also means that he is no longer going to be at the checkpoint. Somebody else will just rise and step into his place. But then we also see some sort of smaller and quicker jokes, the recurrence of the critique of the Arab kiss, or really even just the simple disagreement between whether or not Rachel's Palestinian lover is a terrorist or a freedom fighter. They're not engaging with this in any sort of substantive or meaningful way. They're making fun. And there's tremendous value to that in the way that the film does it. So all of these scenes, I think, are really supposed to be funny. We're supposed to find them humorous. And I really would urge us to admire the filmmakers and the writers of the film for exposing the racism and discrimination that some people in both Jewish, Israeli, and in Palestinian societies feel towards the other. And now, despite the humor, or perhaps because of its comedic approach, the film doesn't even really attempt to grapple in any meaningful way with the complexities of this conflict, or to take sides one way or another. Some may argue that this is the film's greatest strength, that it's simply this absurd and schlocky comedy set in Israel-Palestine that enables us to forget for this sort of short duration, hour and a half, hour, 40 minutes, whatever it is, of the film, that the actual situation on the ground deteriorates every passing day. To me, while I find it to be a very entertaining and quite funny film, its non-committal view on the occupation and on the Israel-Palestine conflict in general is sort of its greatest shortcoming. The relationships are unbelievable, right? In no real situation would an Israeli officer at a checkpoint treat a Palestinian the way that Asi treats Salam. There's no real context for the checkpoints, nor do we see the impacts of, let's say, the restrictions on the freedom of movement for Palestinians, again, other than when Asi takes Salim's ID. But even this is understood only as a tool to manipulate Salam, to write this romantic ending to the soap opera, and not as sort of an oppressive tool or a mechanism of control. Though most of the film takes place in Ramallah, a city in the occupied West Bank, we see very little of what everyday life looks like under military occupation. Not preaching or taking sides enables us as viewers a seemingly unbiased view that allows everyone, regardless of their political stance, to take whatever we want from the political elements portrayed in the film. But in creating a film that does not take a stand, by not pushing for a shifting discourse in Palestine, Israel, Tel Aviv on Fire maintains this status quo, which isn't really working. However, I also think that this raises interesting and important questions about the role of film in general, and specifically the role of films that represent the situation in Palestine, Israel. Must Tel Aviv on Fire take a stand on the occupation or on Israeli state violence? What about taking a stand on the forms of Palestinian resistance, both armed and non-violent? Does the fact that this film is co-written by a Palestinian and a Jewish Israeli relieve the filmmakers of any responsibility of taking a political stand? Or is it a political act just in and of itself by this sort of co-written production? Is the film guilty of distortion or concealment by eliminating historical, cultural, social, political context? I think these are questions worth grappling with. And I'll end by saying that despite all of this, or within all of this, the context of the film as both art and entertainment, or within the context, I should say, of this film as both art and as entertainment, perhaps it's the humor that's the antidote to the enduring disaster of this intractable conflict. Though it avoids tragedy, Tel Aviv on Fire supplies the farce in the right way at the right time. And for that, I'm grateful for the filmmakers for providing us the opportunity to watch it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.
Happy to respond to any thoughts or comments or questions.
Well, let's start. A lot of what you were talking about here in the second half of your talk was this idea of a non-committal political stance or some kind of passive acceptance of the status quo. But on the other hand, we can see comedy itself as a form of resistance, or the co-production as a kind of resistance. And I'm wondering if you can speak to moments besides the production of the film where you saw something that felt to you like resistance.
Yeah, I think it is important to note the role of humor as resistance. And in that regard, I think that this film puts forward a pretty strong resistance to the status quo in and through the humor. And there are certain political elements of the film. So to me, the most prominent sort of humorous moment that really pushes this idea of resistance is when one of the writers of the film makes fun of Oslo. And I don't remember exactly the line, but it's basically saying that Oslo is meaningless and has pushed us nowhere, so we need to move forward. We need to move past that. And this is a very, very clear dig at both the Israeli state for its role in more deeply entrenching occupation after Oslo, but also in the utter failure of Palestinian leadership to make any meaningful ground after Oslo, which was most certainly this deeply helpful moment. I think a very simple line like that really cuts into sort of the way that humor can be used as a tool, both of political resistance and as satire for what the hell have you done to what we thought could happen.
Right, and that he was saying that a marriage between the Israeli and the Palestinian character would be just the same as Oslo, in that it would be meaningless. And that's why it wouldn't be a good way to end the series. And so, yeah, that is the idea of a kind of broken love affair is really interesting here. We have a couple of really great questions. And I do encourage everyone again to use the Q&A box to pose your questions. And so somebody brings up one moment that's not really a funny moment, when the little boy with the soccer shirt is taken into Asi's office because he doesn't have identification, and they're working on the script. And so Asi says, I'm busy, I'll deal with him later, go hold him somewhere. So we know that that's a serious thing that's happening, that this child is being sort of incarcerated in this moment. It's serious for Salam, who he also wants to leave the situation that he's in. So what do you make of that moment? We never return to that boy. We don't see him again. How do you read that?
Yeah, I think that's a very fascinating scene. And this is also why I'm saying that the film is devoid of context, right? So this is something that happens daily in multiple places throughout Palestine and Israel. And they're throwing in this short scene and like, here comes this kid, hold him, take him away, I'm busy. I gotta dip my pita in the hummus, I've gotta eat it, I've gotta think about how am I gonna push this script forward. Meanwhile, what's happening to this boy? He probably has to go to school. Well, does he have to go to school? Where is he going? We don't know. Is he on his way to go meet someone in his family for some health appointment? We don't know. What's going to happen if he's held indefinitely to whatever he's supposed to be doing? What impact will that have on his life if he has to sit there for countless hours? So it's an important scene that we know, okay, here's something that's happening, but it's devoid of the context. And by taking all of the context out of it, I'm not saying that it's not an important scene. It is quite important, but we're missing so much of the political critique that we could gain from a scene like that, right? And I think it's also important that it's a kid, it's a teenager. It's not an old man or someone who is clearly of, let's say, of legal age. This is a minor who is about to be held indefinitely. So that also raises some questions for us. But also, that's not what this film is trying to do. And we have to call that out, that this is not a documentary about freedom of movement or restrictions on movement. This is not a documentary about the detention of minors or arrest of minors. This is not a documentary about, or even a drama or feature film about the checkpoints. So do the filmmakers need to talk about that? Or is it sufficient for us to see this happen in a fleeting moment, in a few short frames, and that's enough to know that something severe is happening in this situation?
Right. I wondered if it was there just to teach the viewer who might not know how important ID is to getting across, so that the ID could be the thing that was held as a bargaining chip over Salam. And what might have happened if we had come back to that boy, if there'd been another shot where we saw him, and what might he have been doing? You're right, in a way it didn't make, the film didn't make a choice about that boy.
Right, but yes, exactly.
So we have some questions about Asi's wife, the officer's wife. And when we're thinking about power in this film, there is some interesting gender power, masculinity questions that come up, and what kind of power she had over him. I was also thinking about how a lot of the motivators for the choices that the characters make in the film they're made because of the actions or because of the desires or the presumed desires of women, right? So Salam becomes screenwriter because the original writer quits. She's a woman, she stands her ground, so she quits, she won't write for that show. The actor Tala, right? The plot has to change because she says, I'm gonna go back to Paris if you make me do this on screen. And of course, Salam is motivated by his love for Maryam throughout the film. So how do you understand the role of women and power, or gender and power in this film?
Yeah, it's an important question, and it certainly plays a prominent role. Another example, though, of where it is with Salam's love interest, the doctor, who he seemingly at once in the past had a relationship with, but has sort of power not only to reshape that relationship, but also she has the power to form some of the dialogue that seeps its way into the TV show. So we see a different sort of gender dynamic, though, in this Palestinian sector of society in this film, and in the Israeli society, right? So there are more sort of robust female characters in the Palestinian society. We have that writer, we have Tala, the actress, we have, I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Maryam.
Yeah, Maryam, thank you. The love interest, the doctor. And then on the Israeli side, we really only have the wife, who challenges Asi, but is not sort of a dynamic character that has any sort of plays any role in pushing anything forward, other than desiring something other than an Arab kiss in the TV show. So I'm not sure, I haven't thought about sort of what this analysis looks like in terms of why there's two different sets of gendered roles playing out in Palestinian and in Israeli society. But I think it's important to sort of struggle with that and know, why does it play out in different ways? Yeah.
Right, we do have that the initial woman soldier who tells Salam to get out of the car. But yeah, you're right, there's really only one Israeli woman featured. And her influence is pretty great, because it feels like all of Asi's choices are based on trying to appease her. So we have another question about the kind of sort of unmentioned character, which is this idea of France or of the West, right? So we have the refrain of, you know, the best thing about Paris, there's no occupation there, which we hear several times. And this film, I actually looked this up. It was Luxembourg's entry into the Academy Awards for Best Foreign Film, I think in 2018. So we have European filmmakers and production companies behind this film. So it is not just an Israeli or Palestinian film. It's also Belgian and French and Luxembourgeois, however they say it. So how do you understand the role, or in the film or in the making of the film, of this idea of the West looking on?
Yeah, the fact that it was the official selection to the Academy Awards from Luxembourg is very interesting. The film was partially funded by Israeli and the government and art scene in Luxembourg. It was mostly filmed in Luxembourg. So the fact that they had to recreate Palestine in Luxembourg in and of itself is, I think, interesting, and to sort of the role that that the West plays. Why couldn't they film it in Ramallah or in Jerusalem, right? If Israel is funding this film and the filmmaker is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, well, there are restrictions on him, legal restrictions on him traveling to being in Ramallah, which is in Area A, to get back to some of the things that were created in Oslo. So he needs to travel all the way to Luxembourg to recreate Palestine in Europe. This recurring line, the best thing about Paris is that there's no occupation, is really profound, because this is a common refrain in Palestinian society. So many people want to leave. They say they want to leave. Why do they want to leave? In part because living under occupation is so oppressive that it reduces them to this form of bare life that they don't want to participate in. And yet, Mariam, I think, has the most important line that shuns the West, that shuns Western influence. She says, I don't want to go to Paris because what do I have in Paris? My family is here. My job is here. This is where my life is. This is a very sort of powerful expression of the Palestinian idea of sumud. Sumud is the Arabic word for steadfast. And there's this principle of steadfastness that in the face of whatever happens to us, we will remain steadfast, we will stay here, and we will ignore the calls for us to leave, if they can leave, and they will remain in place. So despite the desire of some to be in Paris where there is no occupation, Mariam makes the argument, we must be steadfast, we must practice sumud and remain. That doesn't necessarily speak to the Western influences, in the geopolitical situation, other than to say that in the end, everyone remains. No one goes back. Even Talha, who says, I'm leaving, I'm going back to Paris, in the end, she stays to finish filming. That basically says, forget about the West. We need to figure this out here. These third party or these foreign interventions have not worked, won't work. This is up to us to figure out. We have here a Palestinian and Israeli writing a film together. We have multiple sort of ways in which the desire of one person to have the ending of the soap opera be that an Israeli and a Palestinian get together. This is the idea. They want to show that the Western influence is meaningless, that it cannot be the decider in what ultimately happens for the future of Palestine and Israel.
That's really interesting. We have a question about or a sort of a comment question. The idea, sort of in response to what you said, this person thinks that the film did take a powerful position on the conflict by not doing anything more than accepting it as it is. On both sides, the characters take the power dynamic as an accepted fact about which nothing could be done. And bringing back at the boy at the checkpoint, the fact that we never see the boy again is part of that sort of acceptance. So how might you respond to that? And I think part of that is the final, or one of the final lines, which is Salam says there's got to be something between an explosion and a wedding, right? Was that the line? Something like that. Is that what this film is doing? Is it placing itself in between two kind of extremes, political extremes?
Yeah, I think that's actually, all of those are pretty compelling points. First, that perhaps, yes, it is positioning itself in sort of opposition to some of these extremes. What we can see is the sort of ways in which this conflict's future has been hijacked by the extremists in multiple ways and from both sides. That though it is a shrinking population, the majority of both Palestinians and Israelis are ready to move forward. They want peace. They want an end to enduring conflict. And I mean, like, really, it's a small majority at this point. We're talking 52-3% of some of the most recent polls in both sides. But still, that's a majority, as opposed to in the 1990s when it was in the 80s or 90%, something like that, that people still are ready to move forward, but it's been hijacked by the extremes. By situating in between, in the middle, it's saying this is our only path forward. And we cannot let the extremists win. On the other hand, so to respond to the other thing about sort of the disappearance of this Palestinian boy at the checkpoint, I think that's accurate. I think that's right, that the film does take a stand, as I think about it, that by invisibilizing him, we see what we need to see. Or what I like to tell my students, sometimes we really need to pay attention to what's said with what's not being said. The fact that he is not shown again, we have no idea what happens to him, means the officers at the checkpoint don't really care what happens to him. It doesn't matter. And yet at the same time, we know that Palestinian life does matter to the filmmakers. We see Palestinians not in a sort of monolithic way, but is quite robust in a society, despite the fact that we don't really see what life is like in any substantive way of life under occupation. We see them as fully human, as interested in love and interested in art and culture and humor. And I think that's a very important message too of the film, to show an audience that too often in popular culture, certainly in Hollywood, vilifies an entire people. This rewrites the script by showing a different representation of Palestinians and of Palestinian life.
Right, so in being co-written by an Israeli and a Palestinian Israeli, and being about a writer, right? It's a movie about writing movies or writing television. Do you think that the film is taking a position about how the role of writers in television and film in perpetuating the conflict or resolving the conflict?
It is fairly meta that the writers are writing about a writer writing a show, and I think that is interesting, but I really don't think that this film is trying to take an overt political stance to say that film has a role to play in ending this intractable conflict. I don't even think that it's saying anything about the writing of film or production of film or TV. I think they set out to make a film that is highly entertaining, that is totally satirical, and they leave it at that. This is art for the sake of entertainment, as much as it is for sort of the sake of political commentary. Although there is political commentary and satire simultaneously, and of course, I understand and know and think that satire is political theater and an important critique as well. But the fact that the film opens with the television show, we don't know at the very beginning is we think that's the film, and it's shot in a very particular filter, with a particular filter that's very grainy, that, okay, this is what it looks like a few weeks before the 1967 war. And every time they film it, they go back to that. So they're making this stark contrast. And that also, I think, is satirical. It's like this poorly produced soap opera that has become highly popular. I really don't, you can certainly disagree, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this, but I really don't think that this film is attempting to take a very strong political stance in any way, shape, or form. And perhaps that is particularly the stance that this film is taking.
Right, one of our, somebody in the Q&A calls this film a coming of age story about Salam. And I think simply by making a humanizing story, a universal human story about love and getting a job and becoming an adult, that we can see in any kind of global cinema, maybe that's the political gesture, right? In saying, this is a story that's that goes beyond just the situation, just the conflict, right? It's about humans. And so that's the political stance, potentially.
I think that's nice. And I also think that perhaps it's not just a coming of age for Salam, but maybe it's also a coming of age for Palestine, in that Salam represents Palestine in a particular way. And he starts out as this really schlubby guy, can't hold down a job, can't figure out really anything in life. And the statements he makes to this potential former girlfriend sort of torpedo that whole chance for the relationship. And over time, he really begins to blossom into quite a robust and interesting character that is capable of writing this really phenomenal show, or that can then have this relationship with Mariam.
Right, and I think that's the idea that he becomes this successful writer. I mean, one way to read it is that he's actually stealing, right? He's stealing Asi's ideas and Asi's direct language. You know, writers do that, sure. They hear something like that line about tomatoes being the fruit of love. They take from life, but in a way, we can think about what is collaboration really versus, you know, what is theft? And I think in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to consider what those two things might look like, or how we might glorify things that appear to be collaborative, but are in fact dependent on the oppression of one or another people. Okay, so we have somebody who disagrees with your claim that there's no political objective, and I think that's great. And this person says, if either people's point of view was dominant or clearly expressed, neither side, Arab or Israeli, would watch this movie. Being covertly neutral, this movie makes the strongest possible set of statements heard by both sides just by watching this movie. And that's interesting, especially because one of Asi's refrains is this idea that being in love means listening to each other. So maybe that's the political stance here, is both sides get heard, like in marriage therapy.
Which, by the way, he forgets later on in the movie that he even said something like that. So thank you for that comment and for putting that forward and disagreeing. And I think what you're saying is totally legitimate. Why make a film? Deep down, ultimately, you want people to watch it. You want people to watch it. You want them to buy the movie tickets to go see it. So it's all about, in a sense, ensuring that it's entertaining enough for people to watch it. You want to entertain people. You want to make the money back for the people who contributed to the film. You'd like everyone to make more money than that. And I don't agree that that's sort of the way to get people to watch a film, both Palestinian and Israeli, is to have this sort of middle of the road, appease everybody, make everything palatable to everybody. I think actually some of the most powerful Israeli and Palestinian films are the ones that really bludgeon you with one point of view or another, because they really force you to think, do I agree with that? Do I disagree with that? And that's where potentially, hopefully, have some type of productive shift in discourse or even political transformation for some people after watching a film.
I think, yeah, what you're saying here, it resonates a lot with the American situation, right? Where we're a nation that's really politically divided, right? In a different way from Israel-Palestine, but nevertheless, it's true. And the conversation around unity is either like, no, each side should dig in deeper to its position, or should we try and find some middle ground that can bring people together? And whether that middle ground ends up, like you're claiming about the politics of this film, being sort of contentless, right? And not advancing any agenda, because the agenda only appears to be an agenda of presumed neutrality or some kind of moderation. I think it would be interesting to think about that in our election year.
Good question.
One of the kind of follow-ups about the idea of people writing a movie about writers, and in relation to the conflict, is that the industry, the filmmaking industry, and the soap opera industry that the movie is about, both depend on the conflict to advance their plot. So if the conflict disappears from the world, the television show disappears. And then of course the movie that we watch is no longer relevant either. So the conflict is there to advance these stories, even if it sort of remains in the background, right? Sort of contextless. I think it's really interesting to see that, to question the ethics, right, of that need, the need for the conflict in order to tell stories about these people.
Absolutely. I think actually that's a pretty sort of central theme in communities of justice and peace activists in Israel and in Palestine. There's a phenomenal film called One Day After Peace. I believe it's called One Day After Peace. And it features a Jewish Israeli woman of South African descent named Robbie Damelin. She has been very involved with the Bereaved Families Forum, the parent circle of Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families who have come together to form this really profoundly meaningful and important organization that seeks to end conflict so that no other parent, brother, sister, cousin, grandparent will ever be bereaved again for this conflict. So someone made a whole film with and about her, about what happens the day after peace, because there's still a lot of work to be done. That's within the film scene. I once asked a Jewish Israeli activist the same question, a similar question, which is that you're working really, really hard to put yourself out of business. What are you gonna do? Your whole life, the past 3 decades, you have dedicated yourself to peace and justice. And one day, inshallah, there will be justice and peace and end to this conflict, and then you'll have nothing to do. What then? And he scolded me very, very quickly. You don't understand. We already have all of that put together. We already have plans for all of the various elements of society, how we're going to move forward, all the wonderful things that we will be able to do after. we're not putting ourselves out of business. What we're doing is working to get to the next stage in the transformation of our societies. So I think that film and television can play a role in that it doesn't need to perpetuate the conflict, but that imagine the wonderful films and TV shows that will be possible after this. And there's actually a film recently made that imagines this, that imagines, it's a fictional film that imagines what happens right after peace. And I'm very sorry that I can't think of the name of it right now to recommend to you all. I will think very hard and try, if I remember before we finished, I will let you know.
Thank you. A couple people are asking about how you interpret the end of the film. Is it a happy ending? Do we end up in the same place we started? Aside from, I guess, Salam's sort of evolution toward adulthood and his relationship. Yeah, where does it leave us? When the answer is between explosion and wedding and we get neither, or do we get some version of one of those things?
Yeah, I was left a little bit uneasy with the ending of this film, and I love feeling uneasy at the end of films. I really do. I respect filmmakers who can make me feel uneasy, even in a feel-good movie like this. I think the answer to both parts of that is yes. Yes, we feel sort of some sense of resolution, that we go from one place to another, that Asi leaves the military behind and he becomes a successful actor. We see that Salam gets his life together. He figures out not just how to hold down a job, and he gets a fantastic job, gets to write a whole second season, but he also gets to be in this wonderful and loving relationship. So both of these characters really do change and transform. And yet the film ends where it starts, with the same scene, with the lighter. The lighter is a grenade, and which is also very funny. How is the second season gonna end? How is it gonna be that Salam will write this and Asi will act it? What will change, or will nothing change? And perhaps that then is another message of this film, is that while everything changes, nothing changes. And we get further entrenched as we go along. And that is an uneasy feeling for me.
Right, in a way it's the real life version of what Salam's writer's room partner says, where he says, hey, I want a season 2 because I want money, but also I want a season 2 because I want to keep going into this story and going and going and going. And in that way, the way that the conflict is so intractable that it's just going on forever. It feels like, he says, like an American TV show, I want it just to go on forever, right?
Exactly.
We could have 10 seasons of television on fire and no resolution, because there is no resolution. And so that's another political stance.
Exactly. The screen will go black at the end of the 10th season, and we won't know what happens. We'll have to think what happens. And this is the intractable nature of what we're dealing with on the ground in Israel-Palestine.
Right, and maybe the humor that you talked so carefully about is the sort of beacon of hope, right? That in this sort of nightmare scenario, intractable conflict, we can continue to laugh and laugh and laugh. And we're laughing together at the same things. I think that's really important. Or I'd like to imagine maybe that's what's happening.
We're laughing together at the same things, and we're also laughing at each other and at ourselves. So perhaps humor is the way through the darkness.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I feel like that's a great note to end on. Unless somebody else has a pressing question they'd like to type into the Q&A. And otherwise, I want to thank everybody for coming and for listening to this conversation and thinking more deeply about this movie that might seem on the surface just to be fun, right? It actually is, we can take it really seriously and think about its implications. And I especially want to thank Oren Kroll-Zeldin for coming from the University of San Francisco to share your thoughts on this on behalf of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies and Stanford Global Studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate you all. And thank you, Shaina.
All right, have a good night, everybody.